Hi, and welcome back to Shakespeare and Veronaville, the series where we talk about the links between Veronaville residents and the characters of the Shakespeare plays that inspired them. Today we're looking at Much Ado About Nothing, a comedy that Shakespeare wrote in 1598-1599. It features the characters of Claudio, Antonio, Beatrice, Benedick, and Hero. Don't pay too much attention to how these sims relate to one another on the Monty tree though, because none of these relationships are the same in the play, just something to keep in mind. The text I'm going to be quoting from is a modern English translation of Shakespeare's original text that was made by Matt Cosby, and I got it on LitShorts. The play that I watched during my research is a 2007 performance at the Texas Shakespeare Festival. It was directed by Kevin Otos. The links to those two and to all of the material that I used to make this video will be in the description. When the play starts, we're in Messina, in Sicily, at the residence of Leonato, who is the governor of Messina. Leonato is hanging out with his daughter Hero and his niece Beatrice, when a messenger comes to him. The messenger announces that Don Pedro, who is the Prince of Aragon and Leonato's friend, is about to arrive in Messina after a victorious battle. One gentleman has proven particularly brave in battle, his name is Claudio, and Don Pedro has given him great honors. Beatrice asks the messenger if he has any news of Sir Benedick, who's another soldier. Her tone is very sarcastic. The messenger reports that Sir Benedick was also a very good fighter, but Beatrice laughs it off like she doesn't believe it. Leonato tells the slightly confused messenger not to take Beatrice too seriously. Beatrice and Benedick have a particular relationship where they're constantly criticizing and poking at each other, but really it's fine. Note that in Shakespeare, Beatrice and Benedick are not related. And surely enough, Don Pedro arrives with Claudio, Benedick, and Don John, who's Don Pedro's brother, and Leonato welcomes them all warmly. While he and Don Pedro are catching up, Beatrice and Benedick throw some witty remarks at each other, as they usually do. Benedick comments on how disdainful Beatrice always is towards him, even though ladies usually love him. Benedick and Beatrice have the same view on romance and marriage. They're both convinced that that stuff is definitely not for them, and that anyone who gets married is an idiot bound to become a cock in no time. Leonato is happy to be Don Pedro's host for the next few weeks, and he invites Claudio, Benedick, and Don John to stay in his residence as well. And we get a first brief introduction to Don John. All we learn really is that he was in conflict with his brother Don Pedro until recently, but their relationship is now mended, or so it seems. Don John is quite a somber, sullen character who doesn't speak much, but remember him, he will become important. Then, when everyone else has left, Claudio confesses to Benedick and Don Pedro that he's in love with Hero, Leonato's daughter. He knew he liked her already before going to war, but now that the fighting is over and he has the leisure to think about love, he really wants to get married to her. Benedick doesn't see what's so charming about Hero, but his friends chide him about that because Benedick never finds women attractive no matter what. According to them, his heart is just stubbornly unreceptive to women's beauty. To that, Benedick replies that he just doesn't trust women to be faithful, and that's just him being realistic. He claims that he intends to stay a bachelor until he dies. After Benedick leaves, Claudio and Don Pedro get back to the topic of Claudio's love for Hero. Don Pedro is very supportive, and he even suggests that he could talk to Hero on Claudio's behalf at the party that is going to be held that night. It's going to be a masked ball, so Don Pedro says that behind his mask he could pretend to be Claudio, seduce Hero, and also talk to Leonato, her father, to arrange a wedding between Hero and Claudio accepts. In the next scene, Leonato is talking with his brother Antonio. Antonio tells him that he heard that Don Pedro is in love with Hero and is going to ask her hand in marriage at the ball. Leonato is excited at the prospect and says that he'll tell Hero about it so she can be prepared in case the rumor is true. As you can tell, the rumor isn't exactly true. No, it's Claudio who wants to marry Hero, not Don Pedro. the info got distorted, but that's not going to end up mattering, so don't worry about it. I'm mostly just mentioning this scene because that's our introduction to Antonio, who's Hero's uncle in the play. Then we get back to the mysterious Don John, who's talking with Conrad, a gentleman who's a follower of his. Don John expresses his anger and resentment towards his brother Don Pedro. Again, it's never really explained what exactly happened between them. All we know is they had some sort of disagreement, which apparently culminated in the battle that took place right before the play started. That's pretty unclear. And Don John apparently lost the battle. Don Pedro forgave him for whatever happened, but Don John is still very bitter. It's mentioned that Don John is Don Pedro's bastard brother, so that probably means that they don't have the same mother, and Don John's status is inferior to Don Pedro's as a result, which in itself is likely to be one of the components of Don John's bitterness, although that's never verbalized. Borachio, another follower of Don John, comes to inform him that he heard Don Pedro and Leonato talk about the upcoming wedding between Claudio and Hero, and Don John is eager to use this information to cause trouble. Don John is a stereotypical villain almost to the point of parody. It's actually quite fun. In the production that I watched, they had him, Conrad, and Borachio do the stereotypical villain laugh a couple times, and I thought it was pretty on point. Then the evening comes and Leonato's household has gathered for the ball before the men arrive. Beatrice can't help but talk about Benedick again just to mock him some more. Leonato says that she'll never find a husband if she keeps talking so harshly of people, but she says that she thanks God that he's not sending her a husband because she would hate to be married. Then Don Pedro, Claudio, and Benedick arrive and the ball begins. Don Pedro pairs up with Hero as he planned, and Beatrice and Benedick end up together as well. Beatrice doesn't realize that the man she's talking with is Benedick because of the mask, but he does know who she is, and he takes advantage of it a little. He tells her that somebody told him that she was a very contemptuous woman and not as witty as she thinks she is, and she immediately thinks that it must be Sir Benedick who said that. He pretends not to know who Sir Benedick is, just to hear her describe him, and she claims that Sir Benedick is Don Pedro's jester. Benedick is very insulted, but he doesn't let anything show and they dance together with everyone. After the ball, Don John talks to Claudio in private. He's obviously been thinking of a way to sabotage the wedding with Hero. He makes Claudio believe that Don Pedro is courting Hero for himself instead of interceding on Claudio's behalf as he promised. Hearing this, Claudio is very upset. After Don John has left, Benedick finds Claudio all sad. He tells him that Don Pedro has won Hero over, but Claudio takes it as confirmation that Don Pedro means to keep Hero for himself, and so he leaves. Don Pedro comes looking for Claudio, but finds only Benedick, who explains that Claudio is super sad because he's convinced that Don Pedro tricked him. But Don Pedro affirms that no, he did exactly what was planned and Hero is now ready to be married to Claudio. Don Pedro also remarks to Benedick that Lady Beatrice is upset with him because she heard that he said that she was disdainful and not that funny, and so Benedick gets angry. He lets out his outrage from earlier when he listened to her call him the Prince's Jester. And right as he finishes his tirade, Beatrice arrives with Claudio, Hero, and Leonato. And so Benedick leaves to get away from Beatrice. Don Pedro announces to Claudio that he was successful in courting Hero on his behalf, as they agreed, and Leonato gives his blessing for a union between Hero and Claudio. So the misunderstanding planted by Don John is cleared up, and both Claudio and Hero are very happy that they're going to get married. Beatrice is happy for her cousin as well, but she can't help feeling a bit envious. Which is funny because she's been making fun of marriage and men and married people this whole time, but now it seems like she does want some of that for herself too. So Don Pedro is like, "Will you marry me then?" And she says no, but she's all flustered and cute. And then she leaves from too much emotion, I think. Don Pedro says that she would be a perfect wife for Benedick, but Leonato replies, Claudio and Hero's wedding is scheduled for the next Monday, which seems like such a long wait to Claudio, who's very impatient. But Don Pedro has an idea of something they could do in the meantime to have some fun. He wants to make Benedick and Beatrice fall in love with each other, which could be an interesting challenge since they both profess fervently that they want to stay single forever. Claudio, Hero, and Leonato find the idea excellent and they accept to help Don Pedro make it happen. Then we find Don John scheming with Borraccio against Claudio and Hero's marriage. Don John is annoyed that the wedding is going through despite his earlier attempt to have Claudio distrust Don Pedro, but Borraccio has a plan to derail the whole thing. He tells Don John to go talk to Don Pedro and Claudio and tell them that Hero is lying about her virginity and that she's actually in a secret relationship with Borraccio. And as proof, Don John will lead them to spy on Hero's bedroom window in the middle of the night, so they can see for themselves that Hero is talking about love with Borraccio from her window. In reality, Borraccio will make sure that Hero isn't there that night, and instead he'll ask Margaret, one of Hero's waiting gentlewomen, who has a crush on him, to be there dressed up in Hero's clothes. And he'll pretend that he's talking to Hero, which from a distance and in the night should be believable. Don John thinks that it's an excellent plan, and even tells Borraccio that he'll reward him with 1,000 gold coins if he plays his part convincingly. Back at the governor's residence, Benedick has a monologue marveling at how much being in love has changed Claudio. He's a bit sad that Claudio has become all soft now and he misses his old friend. Then he spots Don Pedro, Claudio and Leonato approaching, and he hides to eavesdrop on their conversation. The three men see Benedick right away, despite his attempt to hide, but they pretend not to see him, and they take advantage of the situation to start putting into practice their plan to have him fall in love with Beatrice. So they start talking about how Beatrice is madly in love with Benedick even though she doesn't show it, and that she's just too proud to confess it to him, but really she loves him beyond reason and it's killing her. Which isn't true, but Benedick drinks their words and he falls for it. After they've left, his perspective on Beatrice seems to have changed completely, and he's already starting to consider actually getting married to her. Hero is also playing her part in Don Pedro's challenge. She arranges for Beatrice to hear a conversation she has with her waiting gentlewoman Ursula. They talk about Benedick being madly in love with Beatrice and about how she shouldn't be told about it because she's so full of scorn that she would just make fun of him and break his heart. They also casually remark on how much of an excellent man Benedick is, handsome, clever and brave. Beatrice, listening to this, is a bit shocked that people are calling her too proud and scornful, and she starts self-reflecting. She decides that she doesn't want to be like that, and she's touched by the thought that Benedick would be in love with her. She decides that she'd be willing to marry him. Then we get another scene with Don Pedro, Claudio and Benedick. Don Pedro plans to go back to Aragon after Claudio's wedding, and Claudio proposes to escort him, but Don Pedro says that it would be cruel to separate Claudio from his bride so soon, and they joke that Benedick would make a much better escort because he's available since he's apparently immune to love. But actually, Benedick is all changed, and instead of showing his usual cheerful disposition, it's like he's sick, and he has a toothache, which is very odd. After Benedick leaves, Don John shows up. As he planned with Borraccio, he comes to Don Pedro and Claudio to tell them that he knows for a fact that Hero has been unfaithful. And as expected, they refuse to believe him without proof. So he invites them to see for themselves who Hero talks to at night. And Claudio and Don Pedro follow him to Hero's window. While that happens off stage, we are introduced to Dogberry. Dogberry is a constable who's not the smartest. If you watched my previous video, the compliment on Measure for Measure, you might remember the constable Elbow. Well, Dogberry is very similar to Elbow. He gets words mixed up a lot and overall sounds like an idiot. I'm sorry to this man, but that's how he's presented. And so when we see him for the first time, he's coaching a band of watchmen whose mission is to spot any suspicious activity going on and apprehend suspicious people. They're particularly needed around Leonato's residence on this night because, as Dogberry points out, Hero and Claudio's wedding is happening on the next day, and we gotta make sure that nobody takes advantage of the agitation to cause trouble. Then Dogberry leaves the watchmen to their posts, and shortly after, Borraccio and Conrad show up without noticing the watchmen. Borraccio boasts to Conrad about how well his plan to ruin Hero's reputation went. He says that Don Pedro and Claudio totally fell for his trick with Margaret, and they are now convinced that Hero is a shameless slut, basically. Claudio even vowed to accuse Hero publicly during the wedding ceremony and to leave her at the altar. The watchmen witness the conversation and they arrest both Borraccio and Conrad, who they think are highly suspicious. In the morning, Hero is getting ready for the wedding. She sends for Beatrice, who comes and joins her. Beatrice doesn't seem like herself, though. She's usually very cheery and bubbly, but for once, she seems sick. How odd is that? Hero understands that she's been thinking of Benedick, and she teases her in roundabout ways without letting on anything about the little challenge that she's been taking part in. Meanwhile, the watchmen, headed by Dogberry, tell Leonato that they've apprehended 2 criminals, meaning Borraccio and Conrad, but Dogberry isn't very eloquent and he doesn't really know what he's talking about, so he doesn't exactly catch Leonato's interest, and either way, Leonato is too busy with wedding preparations to explore the matter further, so he tells them to leave him alone and to examine Borraccio and Conrad themselves. Then comes the scene of the wedding ceremony presided by Friar Francis. When the friar asks her if she will take Claudio as her husband, Hero, poor unsuspecting Hero, says yes. But when the friar asks Claudio, he refuses and he accuses Hero of being a whore, with Don Pedro's support. Hero has no idea what they're talking about, and everyone is very shocked and surprised. Claudio and Don Pedro talk about how they saw Hero engaged in lascivious talk with a man at her window the previous night. Hero denies that she talked to any man the previous night, but of course they don't believe her. Hero faints from the emotion, and Claudio and Don Pedro leave. Leonato is very distraught. He even says that the best thing he can wish for to cover his daughter's shame is for her to die right then and there. But she does regain her spirits, just to hear her dad wish her dead. How lovely. Beatrice protests that the accusations against Hero must be false, and Friar Francis says that from watching Hero's reactions carefully, he's also convinced that she's innocent. Benedick remarks that if Claudio and Don Pedro have been misled, the most likely culprit is Don John. Leonato doesn't know what to believe, and he's absolutely furious. Thank God for Friar Francis, though, who is much more calm and who has a plan. He suggests having Hero pretend to be dead from the shock of the accusations that were made against her, and to announce her death publicly. He predicts that this will make her accusers feel remorseful, especially Claudio, who should start loving her even more than before because of how much he will miss her. And maybe the fact that the accusations were false will be revealed. But even if that fails, Hero could hide away as a nun for the rest of her life, since it would be the best thing for her to do if her reputation isn't restored. After Hero is taken away, only Benedick and Beatrice remain. Beatrice is very affected by Hero's downfall. Hero is after all her cousin and they are close friends. Benedick tries to console Beatrice and he declares his love for her, and she says that she loves him too. She asks him to kill Claudio as proof of his love because she wants revenge for her beloved cousin. Benedick first refuses because Claudio is his friend, and Beatrice kind of despises him for that answer. She has an outburst about what she would do to Claudio if she were a man. So Benedick is swayed. He declares that he will challenge Claudio. Then we move on to comical reprieve time, the scene of the examination of Borachio and Conrad. Darkberry, the constable, makes a fool of himself as usual. The watchmen accuse Borachio of calling Don John a villain and saying that he was paid by him to ruin Hero's reputation. In Darkberry's mind, there isn't any doubt that Borachio is slandering Don John and that he should be punished for that, but luckily the sexton, the judge here, sees where the actual crime is. He remarks that Hero was indeed accused and left at the altar, upon which she died, or so he thinks, and Don John secretly fled Messina just that morning. So everything points to Borachio telling the truth about Don John, and the sexton orders that Borachio and Conrad be brought to Leonato. At Leonato's, there's a confrontation between Leonato and Antonio on one side, and Claudio and Don Pedro on the other. Leonato is mad with grief for his daughter's reputation, and he challenges Claudio to a fight. Claudio refuses because he thinks it's kind of ridiculous. Leonato is an old man who doesn't stand a chance against Claudio, who's a renowned fighter. Leonato and Antonio end up leaving after exchanging some strong words with Claudio and Don Pedro, who don't seem to have any remorse or doubts about their accusation of Hero. Then Benedick comes in and challenges Claudio, as he promised to Beatrice. Claudio struggles to take him seriously at first because they're supposed to be good friends, but then he realizes that he is serious, and it must be because of Beatrice. Before leaving, Benedick mentions that Don John has fled the city, which they apparently didn't know, but before they can think about what it might mean, Darkberry and the watchmen arrive with Borachio and Conrad, looking for Leonato. Claudio asks Borachio what his crime is, and Borachio confesses. He's crushed with guilt now that he was told that his scheme resulted in Hero's death. Claudio and Don Pedro are shocked by his confession. They make the connection with the fact that Don John just fled Messina, and they realize that he deceived them. Enter Leonato, Antonio, and the sexton. The sexton has already informed the other two of what's going on with Borachio, and Borachio himself confesses his crime. Leonato is very angry with him, and with Claudio and Don Pedro, who are now fully aware of the mistake they made trusting Don John. They are very sorry for accusing Hero wrongfully, and they ask Leonato to punish them as he thinks is appropriate. Leonato tells them to let the people of Messina know that Hero was innocent, and he says to Claudio that since he can't marry his daughter Hero, he should marry his niece, because conveniently Antonio happens to have a daughter who looks very much like Hero and who is the heir of both Antonio and Leonato. Of course, this mysterious lady is the actual Hero, but Claudio still thinks she's dead. So Leonato asks Claudio to come to his house the next morning to get married to her. Claudio is very thankful for such a nice punishment, and he gladly accepts it. In another scene, Benedick tells Beatrice that he challenged Claudio and is waiting for him to accept the duel, or he'll proclaim him a coward. They continue their eternal battle of wits, with loving undertones, until Ursula comes to call Beatrice to Leonato's home. She informs them that it was revealed that Hero was innocent, and Don John is the one responsible for deceiving Claudio and Don Pedro. So Beatrice and Benedick go to Leonato's together. The next morning, at Leonato's, everyone who knows that Hero isn't actually dead is gathered, including Hero herself, before Claudio and Don Pedro's arrival. Everyone expresses their relief at the turn that events have taken. Leonato deems Claudio and Don Pedro innocent, since they were deceived by Don John. And Benedick is happy that he doesn't need to fight Claudio anymore. The ladies exit, waiting for Leonato to send for them later when Claudio and Don Pedro are here. Benedick confesses his love of Beatrice to Leonato, and he asks for his blessing so they can get married. Leonato gives it to him right before Claudio and Don Pedro arrive. And then Hero, Beatrice, Margaret and Ursula come back in, wearing masks. Leonato gives Hero to Claudio, who doesn't recognize her because of the mask. When Claudio asks to see her face, Leonato tells him that she won't take off her mask before he's sworn to marry her. So he does, without any difficulty, upon which she takes off her mask. And Claudio and Don Pedro are surprised and happy that Hero isn't dead. Before they all go to the chapel for the wedding, Benedick stops everyone because he's had a revelation. He asks Beatrice if she really loves him as madly as he was told, She says no, she likes him, but that's really it. She asks if he loves her as madly as she was told, and he denies it as well. Claudio is like, come on, of course you love her, and he shows a piece of paper with a poem that Benedick wrote for Beatrice. And Hero similarly says to Beatrice, of course you love him, here's a poem that you wrote about him. And Benedick and Beatrice fawn over each other's poem. And they kiss. They never seem to realize that their friends effectively lied to them so that they would each believe that the other was in love. They just believed that their friends were misinformed. But it doesn't matter either way, they're just happy to be together in the end. As everyone rejoices, a messenger comes to Don Pedro to inform him that Don John was captured. Benedick tells Don Pedro not to worry about Don John until the next day, because now it's time to party. They all start dancing and the play ends. So I feel like I should talk about Beatrice and Benedick in the same subsection, because for one thing they're very similar, and also the play focuses a lot on how they interact with each other. As we've seen throughout the summary, their main traits are 1. They're very witty and they love to throw jabs at each other like it's a contest, and 2. They openly make fun of the concept of marriage. In this respect, they're similar to Valentine at the start of The Two Gentlemen of Verona when he mocks Proteus for being in love. Beatrice and Benedick are very critical of each other's gender. For instance, we get Benedick's view on women in Act 1, Scene 1. Initially, Beatrice and Benedick both have extremely high standards in terms of what they would want in a partner if they were to ever marry. In Act 2, Scene 2, Beatrice says that she doesn't want a man who has a beard, but if he doesn't have a beard, then it means that he's too young and less than a man, as she puts it. But if he's not a handsome young guy, then she doesn't want him. But if he's less than a man, he won't be able to handle her. So she concludes that she'll die a virgin, which kind of mirrors Benedick's words about living as a bachelor. In Act 2, Scene 3, Benedick says that he needs a woman to be at least rich, wise, virtuous, beautiful, mild-mannered, of noble rank, well-spoken, and a great musician. So yeah, they both set the bar ridiculously high. About the nature of their relationship, so from the start of the play we know that they've known each other for a while because there's familiarity between them, but actually it seems that there was more than that at some point in the past. After the first ball, when Beatrice calls Benedick the princess jester, Don Pedro tells Beatrice about how much Benedick is riled up against her, and she has a line where she seems to be saying that Benedick and her used to be dating, but something happened and they broke up. This passage is pretty cryptic, and there's never any other hints at a past relationship between them, so that remains undeveloped. But let's try and understand what she's saying. He did lend his heart to me once, and I paid him back with interest, a double heart for a single one. This could mean two things. Either she loved him twice as much as he did, or her heart being double could mean that her love was false, not genuine. Maybe she was in a double relationship, meaning she cheated on him. Beatrice and Benedick both use the image of the cuckold's horns a lot throughout the play, so it could be a reference to that. But then he won it back from me in a game with loaded dice. He gave his heart to her and then took it back, which would mean that he's the one who ended the relationship. In a game with loaded dice suggests that it was somehow unfair, from her point of view at least. Unfortunately, we never get Benedick's perspective on this, but it could explain why they're always bickering now, and maybe if things ended badly between them, it can also explain their attitudes towards love in general. Like, they're very guarded, they hide their emotions under sarcasm, and they set these impossible standards for potential partners, maybe as a way to protect themselves against the possibility of another heartbreak. But sometimes you can see the mask crack and let some vulnerability show underneath. For example, when Beatrice is sad that she's alone while Hero is getting married. Seems like she's conflicted about marriage after all. Maybe she does want love, but she's scared of getting burned again. But in the end, of course, Beatrice and Benedick finally accept to be vulnerable, and they embrace their love for each other. Is it going to be a happy marriage, or is their bickering going to drive them crazy? That's up for us to imagine. Now, in The Sims 2, Beatrice and Benedick are twins. When you start the game, they're children. You can find them in the family bin with their father Antonio. Their mother is Hero, but she recently passed away. We know from Antonio's memories that Beatrice was born first, so she's technically older than Benedick. It might seem a bit strange that Maxis had them be siblings in The Sims when they ended up married by the end of Much Ado About Nothing. But I think it's a recreation of their characters that makes sense because, as I said, Beatrice and Benedick are very similar in the play. I think them being twins in The Sims could be a reference to that. Their physical and genetic resemblance doesn't translate into identical characters though, at least according to their bios. Beatrice's bio says, the more outgoing of Antonio's twins, Beatrice is quite the firecracker, but can she be as sweet as she is sassy? Outgoing and sassy would also definitely be appropriate terms to describe Shakespeare's Beatrice, so no incoherence there. As for Benedick's bio, it reads, Benedick is the gentler half of Antonio's twins. Sensitive and kind, he may someday be essential to solving the question of his mother's death. Shakespeare's Benedick would be better described using Sims 2 Beatrice's bio again, but for the game I understand that Maxis wanted the twins to have distinct personalities. And we will come back to that last part about their mother's death when we talk about Hero. Since Beatrice and Benedick are children, they still have the grow-up aspiration, but they both have a hidden family aspiration token. In the play, my first instinct would be to give them the popularity aspiration, but given how their views about marriage evolve, family could definitely work as well. Now let's look at their personality points. In case you don't know, the white lines under each of the trait scores show what the personality of the sim was at birth. And then over each line you can see the personality points that the sim has right now. There aren't very many ways to change a sim's personality without cheats. You can have a sim use the encourage interaction on a younger relative, or if you resurrect a sim with the resurrectonometron and you don't pay enough, their personality will be altered. I'm explaining this because Beatrice happens to have a current personality that doesn't match her birth personality. However, I don't think that this has any significance in terms of storytelling, because when you look at her birth personality, it's the exact same as Benedick's birth and current personality. So I think that what happened there is Maxis created the twins as exact copies of each other, just with a different gender, and then afterwards realized that they didn't want their personalities to be the same, so they changed Beatrice's current personality with cheats without bothering to fix her birth personality. So I'm going to consider Beatrice's current personality to be the personality she was intended to have from birth. Sims 2 Beatrice is sloppy, more on the shy side, active, serious, and nice. Her outgoing score doesn't really match what her bio says. I mean, I guess she is more outgoing than Benedick by 1 point, but that's a bit underwhelming. Shakespeare's Beatrice would be quite a bit more outgoing than that, and also more playful and less nice, something like this, I'd say. As for Sims 2 Benedick, he's sloppy, shy, active, and more on the playful and nice side. His shy score does match what his bio says. In the play, Benedick is much more outgoing than that, and maybe even more playful. Something like this, I think. We don't actually know that much about Hero in the play. In most of the scenes she's in, she's kind of eclipsed by other characters like Beatrice, who is a lot more talkative and outgoing than she is. It's never said in the text, but we get the feeling that Hero is younger than Beatrice, who seems like an older sister figure to her. They are close, and that's shown very well when Beatrice immediately takes Hero's defense when she's accused of lying about her virginity. Beatrice is very protective of her cousin, to the point that she straight up wants to kill Claudio because he hurt her. To be fair, Claudio did basically destroy Hero's life with his accusations, so I can't say that I think Beatrice's reaction is disproportionate. The name Hero is related to an ancient Greek myth, which Shakespeare definitely knew about and took into consideration, the myth of Hero and Leander. Hero was a priestess of Aphrodite who lived in Sestos, on the European side of the Hellespont, now known as the Dardanelles Strait. Leander was a young man who lived on the Asian side of the strait in Abydos. They were in love, but since Hero was a priestess, they couldn't marry. So instead, Leander would swim across the Hellespont every evening to be able to spend his nights with her. Hero lived in a tower, so she would light a torch at the top of the tower to guide Leander to shore. As a priestess, Hero was a virgin, but she eventually became sexually active with Leander, who pointed out that Aphrodite, as the goddess of love, would not approve of her virginity. And they were very happy until one stormy night. Leander was trying to swim his way to his beloved, as usual, but the wind blew out Hero's torch, and Leander lost his way and drowned in the raging waters of the Hellespont. On the next morning, Hero saw his dead body that had washed ashore, and she threw herself to her death from her tower. She fell in the Hellespont and thus was reunited with her lover. There is one reference to this myth in Much Ado About Nothing. It's during the first wedding scene when Claudio accuses Hero of being unfaithful. He says, "Oh Hero, you could have lived up to your name if only half of your outward beauty and apparent innocence had influence over the secret thoughts and desires of your heart. You could have lived up to your name, meaning you could have been like the mythical Hero, who was so completely devoted to her lover that she killed herself rather than live without him." Hero was considered an ideal of virtuous love, an example for women to follow. This is more of a side note, but I really need to share this information because I think it's clever on Shakespeare's part. In The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Valentine also makes references to the myth of Hero and Leander twice. The first time is in the very first scene of the play, when he refers to Leander crossing the Hellespont as some shallow story of deep love, because at that point he's convinced that people who are in love are idiots and this stuff is all very silly. But then the second time he mentions the myth is when he's detailing to Proteus how he's going to climb to Sylvia's tower with a rope ladder so that he can escape with her. A ladder made out of ropes could be thrown up to her and set with a pair of heavy hooks. These would work to get to another hero's tower, so bold Leander would try to reach her. So at that point you can see that now that he's head over heels for Sylvia, his views on love have completely changed and he's comparing himself to Leander without any irony. And that's it, I just need to share these details now. Back to Much Ado About Nothing. So about that reference that Claudio made, saying that Hero wasn't worthy of her name, turns out that he was wrong, she was still a virgin. I think Shakespeare gave her this name precisely because she is faithful to Claudio, despite what the slander says. But there isn't any obvious parallel between Hero's story in the myth and in Shakespeare beside that. I guess you could say that Hero died for Claudio, except she didn't die, she faked her death. I don't think the two situations are very similar at all. But I think the point is that Hero is virtuous in both stories, and you can presume that after Hero and Claudio get married, Hero will continue to be faithful to him until she dies. In The Sims 2, Hero Monty is the deceased wife of Antonio Monty and the mother of their twins Beatrice and Benedick. The way she died is one of the great mysteries of The Sims 2. I know that a lot more people are invested in what happened to Bella Goth than in what happened to Hero Monty, but both cases are equally interesting if you ask me. We get some very vague info about Hero's death from Antonio's bio. Committed to his children, Antonio is determined to get to the bottom of his wife Hero's death, and what will be his role in the family feud that may have cost him his one true love. So this could mean that Hero died as a result of the feud between the Caps and the Montys, and there's a reference to Hero in her son's Benedick's bio too. Sensitive and kind, he may someday be essential to solving the question of his mother's death. This is even more cryptic and might mean that he has a clue as to how she died somehow, or just that he was very emotionally affected by his mother's death and this might lead him to want to investigate it when he's older. Hero died as an adult, and that's one of the very few things we know for a fact about her death. When you start afresh Veronaville, her death is very recent, as you can tell from looking at her family members' memories. Interestingly, it's not only her husband and children who remember her death. The 4 members of the main Monty household, Patrizio, Isabella, Mercutio, and Romeo, also do, which is unusual because in general, Sims only get memories of the deaths of Sims that they are related to by blood or marriage, or sims that they see die. If a sim dies on a lot, everyone else on that lot will get the memory, no matter their relationship to that sim. So this might mean that Isabella, Patrizio, Mercutio, and Romeo were present when Hero died. Additionally, these memories tell us that Hero died after Claudio and Olivia died, and Antonio also has a memory of Olivia's death, which again is interesting because he's not related to her by blood or marriage, so maybe he was present when she died too. So, could we imagine a scene where Patrizio, Isabella, Claudio, Olivia, Mercutio, Antonio, and Hero are all on the same lot, and Claudio, Olivia, and Hero die one after the other? To determine how likely this is, let's look at what those three sims died from. We know from the color of their ghosts that Claudio and Olivia died from starvation, and we don't know what Hero died from because she doesn't have a tombstone, and therefore she doesn't have a ghost. Starvation doesn't exactly scream sudden death, so Claudio and Olivia dying from starvation doesn't match the idea of all three sims dying off or being killed off in a single event, unless those deaths by starvation are meant to symbolize a different cause of death that doesn't exist mechanically in the game, which is completely up for debate as far as I know. If you're interested in the deaths of Claudio and Olivia, I can direct you to my video on Measure for Measure, in which I explore it more. I'll just mention one thing that might contradict the theory of Claudio, Olivia, and Hero dying in the same event. Romeo has this random memory in between Olivia and Hero's deaths, which suggests that some time passed between the two. So Claudio and Olivia could have died roughly at the same time, but Hero probably died later in a different context. Now, what can Much Ado About Nothing and the Greek myth tell us about what might have happened to Hero Monty? In Shakespeare, Hero isn't actually dead, she fakes her death. Could Hero Monty be faking her death, and that would explain why she doesn't have a tombstone? Cornyregans explores this hypothesis in a blog article about the mystery of Hero's death, which I will link below. She points out a couple of things that go against that theory. First off, everyone in Veronaville treats Hero as dead. In Much Ado About Nothing, Hero's fake death is a group effort. Several people of her entourage are implicated in hiding her and making her pass as dead, while none of the Montys are aware of any such scheme. The only Montys in Veronaville who don't have a memory of her death are the ones who aren't related to her by blood, so they wouldn't remember her death anyway, and the Montys who do remember her death have a plain old death memory like they would for any regular dead sim. And on the Monty family tree, Hero's portrait appears grayed out, like a dead sim's portrait, unlike even the portrait of Bella Goth in Pleasantview. So it seems unlikely that Hero Monty is still alive and hiding somewhere like Bella Goth. Now, if we look at the myth of Hero and Leander, maybe Hero Monty died for her husband Antonio the same way that Hero died for Leander. As we saw when looking at Antonio's bio, he doesn't seem to have a clue, but that doesn't discredit that hypothesis, we just have very little info to go off of. The mythical Hero died when she hurled herself from her tower into the Hellespont. As Cornyregans points out in her article, Hero Monty could have died from drowning, and there is a Monty-style house in the base game house bin that does have a pool, so maybe that's where their household lived before ending up in the family bin. Or, I'll add to that, she might have died from falling from a high place. There is one tower-like structure in Veronaville that immediately jumped to my mind, the old farm silo, which is on the Monty side of town. But, you know, it's a silo, not an actual tower, and you can't climb it. It's just there for storage, so probably not. Or, both the Monty Ranch and 111 Stratford Street have a tower thingy, and since they are both residential lots that the Montys inhabit or have inhabited in the past, either of them could have been the place where Hero died, while all the Montys that remember her death were also present, linking back to what I said earlier. I can see a scenario in which Hero dies by falling off or jumping off the tower of the Monty Ranch or that of 111 Stratford Street. About 111 Stratford Street, I think that could be where Claudio and Olivia died, because it's likely that that's where they lived with their children before they died, and then Mercutio and Romeo moved with their grandparents at the Monty Ranch after they became orphans. So maybe 111 Stratford Street is cursed and Hero also died there. Now let's get back to the idea that she died as a result of the feud. The most obvious conclusion to draw from that is that she might have been killed by a cap. Of course, that's not something Sims can actually do in-game, but let's imagine. Which of the caps could have killed her? None of the living caps have a memory of her death, which means that none of them were present when she died, so none of them are likely to be guilty. And the problem with looking at which of the deceased caps could have done it is that when you look at Veronaville residents' memories, it does appear that Hero is the latest sim to have died in the neighborhood. So none of the dead caps could have done it either because she outlived them all. So there isn't really any evidence that Hero was killed by a cap unless they did it indirectly and weren't present when she actually died. So as far as I can tell, we're left with two options. Either Hero was killed by a Monty, or she killed herself like the hero from the myth. If Hero was killed by a Monty, who did it and why? All the Montys that remember her death have a negative memory of it, and there is no indication of any tensions among the Montys that could have resulted in something like that happening. There is one theory that I learned about in Simish's lore video about the caps and the Montys that says that maybe Hero died at the hands of Antonio, who could have been an abusive husband. Then Benedick's bio could mean that he witnessed the death of his mom but repressed the memory, and in the future he could maybe recover that memory and be essential to solving the question of his mother's death in that sense. But I feel that Antonio's bio contradicts that theory. He really doesn't seem to know how she died, so I think it's unlikely that he killed her. Antonio isn't even grouchy, there's no indication that he would be an abusive husband. I think it's more likely that she killed herself. Why she would kill herself is up for speculation. It could be because of the feud, as Antonio's bio suggests, but we don't have any more specific clue from the game. It could be for the sake of Antonio, as the ancient myth would suggest. Maybe to protect him somehow. Maybe she was the victim of some sort of blackmail from a cap member. Or maybe, another theory that I think is possible, Hero's death has nothing to do with the caps. Maybe, and hear me out, Hero was in love with Claudio. Because remember, in Shakespeare, Hero is with Claudio, not with Antonio, who's her uncle. So maybe Hero Monty wound up married to Antonio because Claudio loved Olivia and not her, but she really was secretly in love with Claudio. And after Claudio died, she was so heartbroken that she killed herself. She could have jumped to her death not for Antonio, but because of the death of Claudio, just like Hero jumped to her death because of the death of Leander in the myth. When you look at Antonio's memories, his memories of getting engaged and married to Hero are positive, but we don't have Hero's perspective. Maybe she was unhappy to be married to Antonio, or she was, fine with it, but it was still her second choice, and no matter how hard she tried, she could never get over her love for Claudio that she kept secret. But you'll tell me this theory doesn't really work with Antonio's bio, which heavily suggests that Hero's death had something to do with the feud. Committed to his children, Antonio is determined to get to the bottom of his wife's Hero's death, and what will be his role in the family feud that may have cost him his one true love. However, and I hope you're still with me, what if we've been reading this bio wrong? So far we've worked with the understanding that the first and the second sentence of that bio are talking about the same person, Hero. In other words, Antonio's one true love is his wife Hero. But what if his wife Hero and his one true love are not the same person? Maybe Antonio and Hero were married but not really in love. Because when you look at Antonio's memories, his memories of getting engaged and married to Hero are positive, but he does not have the memory of ever falling in love with her. This might have been an oversight, but maybe it wasn't. Now, if we go down that path, who could be Antonio's one true love that he lost in the family feud? I see three options. 1, it's someone on the Monty side who died as a result of the feud. 2, it's a cap member who he cannot be with because of the feud. Or 3, it's a mix of both. It could be a cap member who died as a result of the feud. Looking at option 1, as far as we know, apart from Hero, there are 2 Sims on the Monty side whose death could be related to the feud, Claudio and Olivia. Claudio is Antonio's brother, so it can't be him, and I doubt that Antonio's one true love is Olivia because of the text on his memory of her death. It's the generic negative death memory text and not the "this sim was close to me" version, so he doesn't seem to have had any strong feelings for Olivia. Although maybe this is an oversight and it is Olivia. Honestly, I think it is possible. But looking at option 2, if you look at Antonio's relationship panel, all of the caps he knows he considers as enemies, so there's no way that any of them is his one true love. Looking at option 3, let's look at the deceased caps who could have died as a result of the feud. Contessa Cap died from old age, so that leaves us with only 2. Cordelia and Caliban, who both died in a fire. My theory is Antonio's one true love could have been Cordelia, and his attraction might have been requited. The evidence isn't exactly rock solid, but as you've gathered by now, trying to decrypt Veronaville lore in general pretty much always means venturing pretty far into speculative territory. So here goes. Unlike the rest of her family, including Caliban, Cordelia isn't too likely to have hated Antonio when she was alive, because Cordelia was against the feud. We know this because of this one picture, and more tangibly because of her deceased mother Contessa's bio. Contessa is a strong matriarch who can hold a grudge. While she let go of her anger at the Montes and do her daughter Cordelia's memory justice by allowing Juliet to pursue her true love. Which means that, unlike the other Caps, Cordelia would have been fine with Juliet being in a relationship with Romeo. Maybe because she herself had a crush on a Monty. Maybe it was Antonio. So to recap this whole theory I have on Antonio and Hero, maybe Antonio and Hero were on friendly terms, but in a loveless marriage where they were both in love with someone else. Hero was in love with Claudio but couldn't be with him because he was with Olivia, and Antonio was in love with Cordelia but couldn't be with her because she was a Cap. Hero ended up killing herself from grief after Claudio died, and Cordelia died in a fire that was connected to the feud. Now, of course, the issue with this theory, apart from the fact that it sounds pretty wild, is that Antonio has no memories related to Cordelia at all, so maybe that kills it. But at the same time, Antonio has a whole bunch of people in his relationship panel that he should have memories about, but doesn't. Like, he doesn't remember meeting anyone except Hero, which doesn't make much sense. So you could imagine that his memory of meeting Cordelia is like that too, it just doesn't exist even though he did meet her. And he doesn't have a memory of her death, but that's normal because she's not related to him. So that only tells us that he wasn't present when she died. So yeah, kind of a wild theory that doesn't work perfectly, but I thought I'd put it out there. If you have a theory of your own or something to add to what I said, please feel free to share in the comments. I'm eager to have more perspectives on Hero's death. But back to more stable grounds and more concrete things about Hero. In The Sims 2, she's a popularity sim. She's outgoing, serious and grouchy. Shakespeare's Hero could definitely have the popularity aspiration, but I would actually pretty much inverse her personality traits compared to Hero Monty. Shakespeare's Hero is shy, playful, and on the nice side. Shy because of what I said earlier, she's a quiet character who's easily eclipsed by others. Playful because of her enthusiasm for the little game of making Beatrice and Benedick fall in love that Don Pedro instigated. And she's a sweet young woman in general, and she expresses that she really wants her cousin Beatrice to be happy, which to me points to her being rather nice. At the start of the play, Claudio is introduced as a brave and talented fighter. According to his friend Benedick, his love for Hero has made him more soft, but originally he was more of a typical incarnation of virility. This tirade from Benedick is a way for him to comment on how love turns people into worse versions of themselves, in his opinion, but it also tells us about Claudio's personality and the effect that Hero has had on him. The second sentence about the good suit of armor and the fancy new jacket tells us that he's materialistic. And another detail points to this. When Claudio discloses his love of Hero to Don Pedro, he asks him, "Hath Leonato any son, my lord?" And Don Pedro replies, "No child but Hero, she is his only heir." and then they move on, but I don't think his question was just a throwaway line without any significance. He cares about what a union with Hero would bring him in terms of money. Which doesn't mean that his love for Hero isn't sincere, I think it is, but he cares about his own advancement as well, which is coherent with Sims 2 Claudio's fortune aspiration. I think fortune would fit Shakespeare's Claudio as well. Now, in terms of his actions during the play and what they can tell us about his character, two things jump out to me. He falls for Don John's tricks twice. The first time when Don John lies to him about Don Pedro's intention with Hero, and the second time when he lies to him about Hero herself. And secondly, after that second lie that he was told, he chooses to humiliate Hero publicly during the wedding ceremony rather than confront her in private. So let's just say that these two things don't point to him being either very smart or very emotionally mature. There's a lot of misunderstandings in the play because people are drawing conclusions from hearsay or being actively deceived, but it really points to a problem with communication. Of course, this is a comedy, and I don't mean to over-psychoanalyze the characters, but if they would talk to each other more instead of going off rumors or what this Don John guy that nobody really trusts anyway is saying, they wouldn't hurt one another and themselves nearly as much. And I think that Claudio is the biggest offender in terms of bad communication here. After Don John tells him that Don Pedro is trying to seduce Hero for himself, Claudio's reaction isn't to seek his friend to talk to him, no, his reaction is to sulk and withdraw. Like, already that's not great. But then, when he accuses Hero publicly without trying to talk to her at all beforehand, that's just really fucking bad. He's basically destroying her life in public out of nowhere, and that's of course made even worse by the fact that he was wrong. Hero did not have an affair. Apparently, Hero's love for Claudio isn't impacted by that though. She doesn't seem to have a worse opinion of his character after the events, and she's happy to be married to him at the end. Which is already a recurring theme in this series, isn't it? Women being hurt horribly by men who get no punishment and that they end up happily married to somehow. At this point, I'm honestly not sure if this is a commentary on how love makes people blind, or if Shakespeare actually believes that these women having such a weak sense of self-preservation made them virtuous. Thinking back to the myth of Hero and Leander, I'm almost inclined to believe the latter. The myth depicts what a woman's virtuous love was supposed to be like at the time. Undoubtedly, absolute self-sacrifice was seen as the ideal. If you think about Julia in Two Gens, Mariana in Measure for Measure, and now Hero in Much Ado About Nothing, all three women ascribe to that logic of complete self-sacrifice for the man that they love. And the way they're presented, they're very happy to deny themselves, which isn't very realistic. Or maybe it is. Because they're young, I don't know. That's actually very sad. Although, of course, we don't know what happens to these relationships after the play ends. In the real world, I don't think that marriages based on such rotten foundations could ever turn out happy. But back to Claudio. In The Sims 2, Claudio is a dead sim who is married not to Hero but to Olivia. We've talked about that before. And he had 2 sons with her, Mercutio and Romeo, plus an unborn baby who tragically died when Olivia died. In the previous episode, I talked about how Claudio, Olivia, and unborn baby Monty's deaths could relate to Claudio's story in Measure for Measure. I still think that's relevant, but if you remember, the personality of Measure for Measure's Claudio didn't seem to match Sims 2 Claudio very well at all, and he also didn't come off as someone that the fortune aspiration would fit very well. In Much Ado About Nothing, it's kind of the opposite. Claudio's story doesn't fit Sims 2 Claudio, but their aspirations and personalities are a better match. So I think that what the Sims wiki says about Claudio Monty possibly being a spoof combo of his 2 namesakes makes sense. Sims 2 Claudio is neat, active, serious, and grouchy. I'd say Much Ado About Nothing Claudio is just a bit nicer and more playful, and I'd leave his active score as it is because of his prowess as a soldier. In Much Ado About Nothing, Antonio is Leonato's brother and Hero's uncle. We also know he has a son, although we never see him. Antonio is a secondary character who doesn't have a huge impact on the play. His most notable appearance is in the scene of the confrontation between him and Leonato versus Claudio and Don Pedro. At that point, Hero is rumored dead, but Claudio and Don Pedro are still convinced that she was guilty, and they show no remorse for accusing her. Antonio and Leonato are both very angry with them. It's very apparent that they love Hero and want to defend her honor and their own, but they're in over their heads when they challenge Claudio and Don Pedro because they're old men, as the younger two don't fail to point out, and they don't stand a chance, so they can't be taken seriously and no actual fight breaks out. All I can really say from this is that if Much Ado About Nothing Antonio were a sim, I would give him the family aspiration. In The Sims 2, Antonio has the knowledge aspiration, although his bio hints that family could be a good secondary for him. I don't think there's really any substantial connection to be drawn between the Antonio in Much Ado About Nothing and Antonio Monti. As you know by now, Shakespeare used the name Antonio for several of his secondary characters, and of course we're free to draw inspiration from them if we wish to, but I doubt that Maxis had them in mind when they made Antonio Monti. The Antonio who gave his name to Antonio Monti is most likely the one from The Merchant of Venice, which is the play we're going to talk about in the next episode, because Antonio is the title character of that play. So there should be more to say about Antonio then. And that concludes this episode. I hope you found it interesting. I didn't think this one would be this long, but as it turns out there was a lot to say, especially on the mystery surrounding Hero Monti. If you want more about Much Ado About Nothing without necessarily the connection with The Sims, I can recommend you watch a presentation that was given about the play by Dr. Paul Boudra, the link is below. I didn't mention it in my intro because I watched it after writing the script and I didn't end up changing the script after watching it, but Paul Boudra gives an interesting perspective and also talks about literary context elements that are beyond the scope of my video, but that are super interesting if you like this stuff. And what he says about Claudio is pretty funny, I kind of agree. So next time, as I said, we're going to take a look at The Merchant of Venice, featuring Antonio, Bassanio, and Portia. Only 3 Sims this time, so it should be a shorter vid. Might still be an important one though, because Antonio is an interesting Sim, but also Bassanio is actually the founder of the Monti clan. He's the first Sim with that name in the Monti family tree. So I'm hoping to find enough material on him to flesh him out to a satisfactory extent. But that's it for now. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Bye!
Capaditos!